Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiara Yakini, and I work in the Community Engagement and Education Division at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. I will be your moderator for the evening. For full accessibility today, it is critical that speakers first identify themselves by name before proceeding to speak and mute their microphones after they are done speaking. We have ASL interpreters on screen, and live card captioning is available by turning on subtitles using the CC icon on the lower part of the screen. We will have a question and answer portion during today's session, and attendees can use the Q&A function on the lower part of the screen to type in questions for our panelists at any time. With that said, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the first monthly installment of our 2023 MI, spelled M-I, Response to Hate virtual campaign forums. We will have a new installment every month through September, at which time the campaign will culminate with our annual My Response to Hate conference. Some of you may have begun participating in these forums with us last year. If so, welcome back. For those of you who are new, we are very excited to have you. It is our hope that these forums will provide you with the information pertaining to hate and bias prevention that you can implement and use in your daily lives, at your places of work, in your schools, and in your communities. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into today's topic. Today, we will be talking about hate crime reporting. We have a dynamic panel of presenters lined up for you today who will lead us in exploring hate crime reporting from a variety of different angles. We also have a very special surprise presentation for you at the close of the forum, so we ask that you all stay tuned until the very end to check it out. Now, our first presenter will discuss the federal hate crimes data and the importance of classifying these crimes properly. He will also discuss ways to overcome reporting barriers between local, state, and federal law enforcement organizations. Please welcome Supervisory Special Agent Patrick M. Guillohan, who is the current supervisor of the FBI office in Ann Arbor, Michigan. During his 17 years with the agency, SSA Guillohan has served in multiple field offices and at FBI headquarters in both criminal and national security roles, as well as serving as an FBI instructor, undercover operative, and forensics technician. He is a 2019 winner of the FBI Medal of Excellence, and it is with great honor that I introduce him to you today. SSA Guillohan, you now have the platform.
All right, thank you, Tiara, and thank you everybody for attending today. I would say it's good to see everybody, but that's not really how Zoom works. I am here to talk to you today about federal hate crime reporting and some of the issues that surround it. And Danita, if you could toss those slides up for me whenever you get a chance. There we go. So we are going to talk today mostly about the federal side. Some of my fellow presenters are going to talk about state issues and all that. I'm going to be focused fairly heavily on the federal side of things. So as we start this talk, I want to start by talking about the federal definition of a hate crime. If you could jump to the next slide, Danita. And it's important to talk about this because all of the hate crime reporting that we're going to discuss here comes from this definition here. So here's the federal definition summarized greatly. There first has to be an underlying offense. Okay, so something illegal has to have been done to start out with. And then that offense must be committed or enhanced because of that person's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Now, a couple things that I want to point out here before we move on. Note that we say committed or enhanced, okay? So on one hand, if we have an offense that is committed because of someone's actual or perceived, there you go, that's a problem. But also if the crime was enhanced because of that, okay? As an example, if there is a fight that begins, okay, for a normal, non-biased reason, but one of the participants goes farther than they would if they and the other person shared the same race, that can be classified as a federal hate crime, okay? Also note the because of part. We're going to talk about that in a little bit in a minute, but we have to draw a causative link between the bias and the event. Next slide, please. Danita, if you wouldn't mind changing slides for me there. So part of this is that one of the issues that we run into is that evidence of perpetrator bias is not enough on its own. We have to have objective evidence that the incident was perpetrated by the bias. So here's an example. Let's say that we have someone driving one of those vehicles that we see far too often with various racist symbols on it and all of that sort of thing. If they get into, say, a car accident with someone who is of a different race than they are, well, the car accident likely wasn't perpetrated by the bias, right? You don't necessarily know who's driving the other car when you get into that accident. So we would not consider that a hate crime, right? Even though one of the perpetrators had a very significant bias, we don't have evidence that the incident was perpetrated by that bias, okay? Here are some of the questions, and this is not an exhaustive list, some of the questions we ask ourselves as we try to determine where bias may come into an incident. Were the victim and the offender of a different race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, okay? Did the offender make bias-related comments, statements, or gestures? Were bias-related drawings, marking symbols, or graffiti left at the crime scene? Were objects, clothing, or symbols indicative of violence used? Now, this is one that sometimes people have questions about. What do we mean here, okay? Well, the sort of defining category of clothing indicative of violence would be, say, a Nazi symbol, right? Or the infamous KKK hood and robe, all right? Obviously, if somebody's wearing that, that's a strong indicator of violence. The next one, was the victim underrepresented in the area where the incident occurred? Okay, are we talking about the old school sundown towns, things like that? Was the incident one of many where members of a particular group were targeted? The second to last one here is one that I consider to be vital. Was the victim engaged in activities related to their race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, okay? Been seeing a lot more of this lately, right? If I am at a protest for, say, Black Lives Matter, and I get attacked at that protest, it is not hard to draw a link between that participation, bias, and the event, okay? Next slide, please, Danita. Okay. So I wanted to very briefly talk about incidents that are not federal hate crimes. And I mention this because these are things that oftentimes people think are federal hate crimes and do not get counted in the statistics. Now, one thing that I will mention here is that the federal definition is the one that we use. Each state has different definitions. Different advocacy groups have different definitions. Those are all valid definitions, okay? I don't want to criticize somebody's feelings on this. And I don't want to diminish the harm that events like this can cause. So I'm not saying here, and we're not saying that these aren't harmful actions. We're saying that under the federal definition of hate crime, the following things don't count. So the first one, display of bias items, symbols, clothing, or gestures that are not otherwise used to commit a crime, okay? So the use of racial language, especially when it occurs on the internet and it's not directed to a specific person, okay? Not a federal hate crime. Disagreement with, criticism, or derision of advocacy groups that does not otherwise rise to a harassment crime or similar, even if that criticism, disagreement, or derision is rooted in bias, okay? Again, if somebody says that they don't like Black Lives Matter, or they don't like a Jewish advocacy group, or they don't like a Muslim advocacy group, even if they are absolutely biased to their core, it still does not count as a federal hate crime. Okay? The final one I list here, advocacy for changes in policy or law, even if that advocacy is rooted in bias. Again, everyone has the right to petition their government for changes to laws and changes to policy. And even if we find those changes abhorrent, and even if we find the people going for them to be biased, that's still not a federal hate crime. Okay? Next slide, if you would, Danita, thank you. So let's look at some hate crime statistics. So these are statistics we compiled from 2011 through 2021. And these are broader categories, okay? So you have bias based upon race, ethnicity, and ancestry, okay? That's a very, very large component there. Next up, you have a bias of religion, bias of sexual orientation, okay? Then you have bias of gender identity, bias of disability, then you have bias of gender, and then finally you have multiple bias, okay? That's a time when you have several categories coming together and a crime was perpetrated because of that, okay? Next slide, if you would please, Danita. All right. So some specific categories. Now, the categories that we saw on the last screen were very broad. We do break them down a little bit more. So number one here, anti-Black or African American, that accounted for 30% of the hate crimes that we saw in the past decade. Okay. It's a very, very large number. Anti-Jewish comes up next. Number three is anti-white. Okay. Now that's a bit of an odd one, right? Like we wouldn't normally consider crimes committed against white folks to count as hate crimes. But one of the things that's important to understand here is that all of our hate crimes legislation is content neutral, okay? And what we mean by that is that we categorize bias against race, but we don't categorize bias against a specific race, okay? So there's a category for anti-white violence, and apparently that got reported a lot more than some of these others. Next up, anti-gay male. You will see in a moment that we actually break that down in there. Anti-Hispanic or Latino, and then anti-LGBTQ mixed group. Okay, that would be an attack against a group of people that has various definitions in the LGBTQIA space. All right, next slide, if you would, Demetra. All right, so let's talk about what I'm really here to talk about, which is how we get the information about hate crimes. And to do that, we have to start out by talking about NIBRS, okay? NIBRS is the National Instant-Based Reporting System. It is run by the FBI, run by our Universal Crime Reporting Division. By law, we are the national clearinghouse for crime reporting for all federal, state, local, and tribal agencies, okay? We collect this data through NIBRS. NIBRS participation is mandatory for all federal agencies and optional for state, local, and tribal agencies. Some participate, some do not. Okay, there's various reasons for that. If I had much longer time here, I could talk about some of them. But the general gist of this is that all federal agencies are reporting to NIBRS accurately. It is optional for state, local, and tribal. Next slide, please. All right, so how do we collect hate crime data? Well, the Bureau also holds the marker on collecting hate crime data. And what we've decided to do is we do so through NIBRS reporting on specifically on bias motivation, okay? And I'm going to show you a NIBRS record here in a moment, and you're going to see where bias motivation fits into that. But we don't collect separately, right? Again, remember the original definition of a federal hate crime. There has to be an underlying offense, and then we have to have that bias motivation on it. And the NIBRS records reflect that. As before, federal agencies are also required to report on bias motivation. State, local, and tribal agencies are not. Next slide, please. So this is a typical NIBRS entry, okay? This is not how it looks in the NIBRS system. This is a infographic that kind of shows you that, okay? You see that we collect all kinds of data. We collect data about the administration, offenses, property, offenders, arrestees, and victims. If you would just advance one to pull up the highlighting, please. Thank you. So you'll see up here in the upper right, you'll see that under the offense segment, bias motivation is listed in there. But you will also notice under offender segment and victim segment, we collect data about the age, sex, race, and ethnicity of the offender, the same things plus residence status of the victim. We do that to measure how crimes affect different people of different categories. But it also allows us in some cases to go back and perhaps reclassify a crime after further investigation, okay? Let's go ahead one more, please, Denise. So these are the different bias motivation categories that exist right now. Now, these categories are ever changing, okay? So they don't always stick. In fact, I know some of these that have been added or removed over the years. Obviously, we can't have a category for every particular thing, but we do try to break out the ones that we think occur more often so that we can track them better. You will notice that each category, with the exception of the bottom one, each category has kind of a blanket one that we can fill in. One of the things that our universal crime reporting people do is they're constantly looking at these categories for things that may need to change. Denitra, if you'll advance one more to pull up the highlighting. I want to highlight this bottom one here, okay? There are two separate categories here under none or unknown. One is none or no bias, that's code 88. The other is unknown, that's code 99. We're going to talk about this in a moment when we talk about some of the issues, but note there is a difference between no bias and unknown. Unknown means we have no idea if there was a bias issue here. That's 99. 88 means we have looked into this and we have determined that there is no bias. Two separate things. One we don't know, one we know, and the answer is no. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so to kind of finish this off, the meat and potatoes of what I was here to talk to you about are some of the issues that we have in getting hate crimes data into NIBRs, okay? The first one, lack of a requirement for state, local, and tribal agencies to report to NIBRs at all, okay? There is no specific motivation for a given agency to report to us. A lot of them do. Because that's something that takes it off our plate, but quite a few of them don't. Some will report their own data with their own standards. Others don't bother at all. Next, please. Secondarily, even if they are putting data in NIBRs, there is currently no requirement for them to tack on the bias motivation piece. So even if they are putting things into NIBRs, there's still a lack of requirement for state, local, and tribal agencies to report the hate crime data. Okay? Next, please. All right, so a big one, lack of comprehension of proper definition of hate crime. Okay, so I explained to you up front the federal hate crime definition. It's worth pointing out here that that's confusing even for people who work in this space all the time. A lot of times, especially with local agencies that perhaps don't have a lot of NIBRs training, there's an issue with convincing people what a hate crime is. There's a thought that a hate crime is only something where the racism or the gender bias or the religious bias is obvious and out there, right? If I'm not wearing the KKK hood or I'm not wearing a swastika armband, it's not a hate crime. The definition is broader than that, and sometimes that's not well understood. Next one, please. Lack of knowledge of hate crime categories. Okay, this is one that's often problematic for us because sometimes people will think of a hate crime and they will only think race, or they will only think anti-Semitism. They won't think of other kinds of religious bias or other kinds of, gender identity bias. Gender identity, by the way, is fairly new in the federal hate crimes definition. We often see times where people simply aren't thinking about it because they don't look at gender identity as something that we would cover. Next entry, please. Okay. Misunderstanding what constitutes a reportable hate crime. And I put in parentheses, charging is not required. So this often comes up in states that have their own hate crime designator, okay? Michigan has one, several of the other states I've worked in have as well. The state does not need to charge a hate crime for it to be reportable as a hate crime to us. That bias motivation section should be filled out for every crime. And it doesn't have to meet the charging definition at either the federal or state level in order for us to count it as bias motivation. Next entry, please. All right, lack of investigation for potential bias, okay? When I was prepping this, my wife called it laziness. That's kind of fair, but it's also sort of a lack of motivation, right? If I'm a regular investigator and I have an assault case, it doesn't really matter much if I go looking for potential bias, okay? If it's not really chargeable as a hate crime, and oftentimes it's not unless the bias is really significant, do I have any reason to look deeper, okay? I would love to see them do more because that's important to us, but oftentimes there's simply no reason for them to go forward other than to be good guys to us. Next entry, please. All right, improper use of category 88 versus category 99. All right, this is a little bit deep, and for my data scientist people, you will love this. The rest of you may be bored by this, okay? But oftentimes we will see brand new entries into NIBRs come with a category 88 designator. We've looked into this and there's no bias. Probably a little early for that, guys. You're probably still at category 99. You have no idea what the bias is, okay? We see a lot of places go straight to 88 when realistically it should be 99. Next entry, please. All right, this one's big. Lack of updates as circumstances change. A lot of times we have agencies that are very good about putting things in NIBRs when they happen. They're really bad about going back and changing them when things change. This is, again, a big problem when we talk about category 88 versus category 99, right? Even if you put it in as category 99 at the beginning, you may want to go back and think about that, rethink that later. Maybe it's category 88, maybe it's category something else. This is also true as we identify people later. Sometimes you'll have a crime, murder being a fantastic example. When you put it into NIBRs, You have no idea who the offender is, what the motivation is, all of this stuff, okay? Agencies have to go back and update NIBRs as circumstances change, and they're often very bad about that. All right, so that is the end of my time. That is the end of my presentation. I will be sticking around for the Q&A at the end. If you have questions for me, feel free to throw them in the chat or ask me at the end. Thank you all for your time, and Tiara, I will throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, SSA Guillahan. That was a very insightful look into hate crime reporting and how we can overcome some of the barriers that we see. I'm sure that we will have questions for you at the end of the program. But right now, we're going to continue exploring ways to overcome reporting barriers, but this time pertaining to victims. Please welcome Alexandra Wyatt, who is a victim advocate in the Hate Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Unit at the Michigan Department of Attorney General Office. Alex has spent her career passionately advocating for survivors of crime and is skilled in crisis intervention, lethality assessment, and safety planning. Before Alex came to the AG office, she ran the Victim Assistance Program at Common Ground, a nonprofit in Oakland County that served victims of all types of crime. Alex holds a master's degree focused in counterterrorism and homeland security from IDZ Herzliya, Israel. Alex, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Tiara. Good evening, everyone. As Tiara said, my name is Alex Wyatt. I'm a victim advocate in the Hate Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Unit here at Michigan Department of Attorney General's office. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to thank Tiara and the whole team at Michigan Department of Civil Rights for having me here for this very important discussion. I think we'd be amiss if we didn't discuss the barriers that victims face when it comes to reporting hate crimes. And tonight, I'm going to discuss a few of those. There is a large amount of barriers that victims face when reporting crimes, and tonight I'm going to just focus on 4. Next slide, please. The 4 barriers that I want to focus on tonight are fear of consequences, mistrust of law enforcement and first responders, lack of awareness, and accessibility. I want to reiterate again that there are multiple barriers in a comprehensive list, but these I think are very important to focus on for our conversation tonight. Next slide, please. The first one I would like to talk about is the fear of consequence. I think one of the biggest barriers in reporting a hate crime is the fear of the perpetrator. Just like in many other crimes and other instances, the fear of retaliation is very real to a victim. How will it affect them? Will it get worse? Will they do something else? And I think we have to think about hate crimes, as we know, as messaging crimes, and that they affect the community. So not only as an individual thinking about, will it get themselves in trouble and make it worse, or will it affect the entire community? Specifically, when we're looking at the LGBTQ plus population, there's the fear of being outed. Many times people have not come out and have told family and friends of whether or not they are gay. And if they report this crime, it becomes very public. Another thing to think about is the affecting relationships. For those that are disabled and are dependent on somebody taking care of them, but they are the person that in fact is perpetrating the crime, becomes a very big issue of whether or not to report it. It affects those core relationships. And therefore we have many different issues and variables that come to the fear that a victim has if they do report this crime. Next slide, please. This one is very big, and this is a mistrust in law enforcement. And unfortunately, we are dealing with an era where this is very, very prominent. A lot of victims that I have heard over decades have a fear of past experiences and family experiences with law enforcement and not treated appropriately. So they fear how they will be treated, that they will not be taken seriously. And this becomes a very big issue. And beyond the top reasons of the reporting issues that Special Agent Guion suggested, there's the issue of even going forward to report it to law enforcement because they could possibly not be taken seriously or face either further victimization or discrimination by police. They may fear that they won't help at all. A lot of times these populations some marginalized groups come from different countries where law enforcement was not take them seriously, and they were persecuted because of it. So they have that external fear and that historical fear that something more would happen. Next slide, please. Another great barrier that we face is the lack of awareness, lack of knowledge and understanding of the hate crime and the process. I think it was really great that our Special Agent Guion went over the hate crimes because that is important in understanding the knowledge of when the crime is committed, right? There's a lot of misunderstanding on what a hate crime is. And education for victims and witnesses and bystanders is so important for communities to be aware that when they do call out and they get the courage to call law enforcement, that they can state, this happened on a certain holiday, right? It happened on Yom Kippur for the Jewish community, and this could be a hate crime. Making sure that the police are well known, that there could be a bigger reason as to why this is happening. And they may not even know how to report. Reporting barriers are as simple as not knowing that they can call law enforcement or call resources that are available to them. Next slide, please. And lastly, I want to focus on accessibility. In my time in this position, I have come to realize that a lot of people have an issue with the fact that they don't know that translation services are available. And that becomes a huge barrier. If somebody cannot speak the language and speak English and feel confident that they will be heard when they come to report, why would they report in the first place? I think having the accessibility of translators, having it available on windows of agencies or on websites to make people aware that they have the ability to ask for a translator at a police department or at a community place where they go to seek resources. Another great barrier for accessibility is the physical accessibility. If they don't have transportation to make the report, or maybe they're in an area where they can't make a report online, they don't have the capabilities of online or have capabilities of going to the internet. These all can make a huge difference on whether or not they will make a report. Next slide, please. I think it's important to understand all of these barriers so we can understand how we can overcome them. And the way we do it is like events like this, educating the public and letting them know what a hate crime is, what barriers they face, and how can we overcome it by working together. Educating our community members, our family, our friends, letting them know what services are available, how online reporting works, and then looking at police departments, helping train them against discrimination and how to deal with different communities when they go out into the public. Making resources more available for people can help us overcome these barriers. Next slide, please. One way our state has been able to do that is by creating this unit. The Hate Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Unit was created in 2019 by our Attorney General, Dana Nessel. And she noticed that there was a huge barrier when it came to these instances. So investigating and prosecuting hate crimes and domestic terrorism is specifically what our unit does. We go out and we work with law enforcement to provide resources. We work on educating communities, events like this, or law enforcement and prosecutors. And then we coordinate with local, state, and federal law enforcement on these cases so we don't reach those issues of reporting. Next slide, please. And I think it would be silly for me not to let you guys know how you can report a hate crime in our state. And these are 4 ways that you can do it. You can call your local police department. Please, if it's an emergency, dial 911. Or you can go and dial a non-emergency number at your local agency. If you don't feel comfortable at your local agency, you can go to the Michigan State Police at a local post station. Or you can contact our office directly at the hatecrimes@michigan.gov or contact our phone number. And also there is the FBI. They have a 24-hour phone number that is available for people to report a hate crime. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight. I know I kind of went through quickly everything that we discussed, but if you ever have any questions or need resources or want to talk out what has happened, please do not hesitate to reach out. My phone number is on the screen and I'm available. Thank you so much, Tiara.
Thank you, Alex. That was a very informative presentation, and it really highlights the importance of making sure that victims understand our processes and that our services are accessible for them. So thank you again for that. I would just like to remind our viewing audience once again that all presenters will be available for questions at the end of the program. Now that we have explored ways to overcome reporting barriers, we're going to switch gears just a little bit to learn about the process for collecting hate and bias data here in Michigan. I am pleased to present our next presenter, Ann Mahar, who is a departmental analyst at the Michigan Crime Incident Reporting Unit and lead trainer. Ann joined the MICR unit at the Michigan State Police in 2021. In the MICR unit, Ann is focused on training, quality assurance reviews, data quality, and testing. Previously, she has worked in research positions and as a professor of criminal justice. Ann received her PhD in criminology and criminal justice from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia in 2015. Welcome, Ann. We are really glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Tiara, and everyone joining us today. So as Tiara mentioned, my name is Ann Mahar, and I work in what we call the MICR unit. And my presentation is going to be on collecting bias-motivated crime data in Michigan. Next slide, please. So the MICR unit is the state repository for incident-based crime data. So as Sergeant, I'm so sorry, Special Agent Meehan had mentioned earlier, we collect incident-based crime at a national level. So for the state of Michigan, the MICR unit collects all of that data from all law enforcement agencies in the state of Michigan. We began in 1959, initially report law enforcement agencies. It was voluntary for them to report crime to the state repository. However, since the late 60s, it has been mandatory for all law enforcement agencies to report to the state. And the MICR unit is housed in the Criminal Justice Information Center, also known as CJIC, which is housed within the Michigan State Police. Next slide, please. So the MICR unit has many responsibilities. These are kind of some high-level ones that I wanted to point out because the collection of hate bias is involved in every single thing that we do. So, as I said, we collect data from law enforcement agencies across the state. We also conduct MICR training, and part of that training is talking about how to collect bias-motivated crimes, what the different bias motivations are, and some of the details that were given in the first presentation of how to tell if something is bias motivated, other than just those really obvious kind of examples. We also conduct quality assurance reviews, which is when we request narratives from agencies across the state and review to see if the reporting is in line with MICR standards. We also conduct testing and certification. So In that process, if an agency moves to a new record management system, we make sure that the data that they're sending us is what we're receiving. And in that process, we've been able to find issues sometimes with a particular system not having all of the hate bias codes that we require. So in that process, we also are able to look at bias motivated crimes. We also produce an annual report. Included in that annual report is a section based on hate crimes. And of course, we submit all of our data to the FBI NIBRS collection. Next slide, please. This definition is probably going to look pretty similar, a little familiar, but in MICR, a bias-motivated crime is defined as a criminal offense committed against a person or property, which is motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. So, as was discussed in the first presentation, bias motivated or hate crimes are not collected separately. The bias motivation is an element that makes that criminal act bias motivated or makes it a hate crime. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Hey, there we go. Okay. So these are the categories of bias that are accepted in the state of Michigan, as well as all of the subcategories. So again, these are going to be very similar to what was covered in the first presentation. So we have bias against race, ethnicity, ancestry, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and religion. Additionally, the state of Michigan collects two other categories that are described as anti-other bias, which we're going to dive into a little bit deeper in just a minute. And the state of Michigan also collects anti-law enforcement as a bias type. Next slide, please. So in collecting data for the state, there are a few things I wanted to point out in how the data is submitted to MICR. So since reporting is incident-based, every incident has at least one offense or criminal behavior, but there can be multiple offenses in an incident. So to highlight kind of how integrated bias-motivated crimes are, each offense submitted to MICR requires an entry for bias motivation. So for every offense on an incident, there has to be an entry for bias motivation. So it can be none, or it can be any of those categories that I had on the slide before. And each offense can have a different bias. So if there's multiple offenses on an incident and one offense was committed because of a bias towards someone's gender, and another offense was committed because of a bias towards their religion, both of those could be captured in that incident. They don't have to be the same. In our activities focused on data quality, we have some that are able to focus on bias motivated and hate crimes. So we do quarterly verifications where any offense that has a bias motivated category listed, agencies are asked to verify that those were bias motivated. And recently we updated this process. Historically, this was done mainly via fax and is still largely done via fax, which surprises me, but I digress. And so now also is done via email, and most recently we made it available on our application. Additionally, in our quality assurance reviews, If an agency has reported a bias motivated crime, we always include that narrative in our request to make sure that we have the opportunity to read, review, and make sure that those incidents are being reported properly. Next slide, please. So recently I had the opportunity to do some research and a bit of a deep dive into our other bias category. So as Tiara had mentioned, I did do a PhD in criminology and criminal justice. I taught for a while, so research projects have always kind of been my deal. So in 2022, the micro unit was starting to come together to write our annual report and for the data submitted in 2021. And we found that in 2021, Micro had collected 669 bias motivated offenses. Additionally, there were another 214 offenses that were submitted with the bias category of other bias. So this kind of developed this dialogue amongst us on if we should be counting these other bias offenses in our state total for bias crimes. So essentially kind of kicked off the research project that I ended up starting and then presenting at the American Society of Criminology conference last November. And the things that we looked at are these offenses bias motivated? And if they were bias motivated, what was the bias? So I ended up requesting almost 200 incidents to capture all 214 of those offenses from 72 different agencies across the state. Got a pretty good response rate. Almost 90% of agencies responded, and we found some pretty interesting things. So next slide, please. Our findings include that most of the offenses were not bias motivated. So in requesting these narratives from agencies, off the top, almost half of the agencies said that these were not bias motivated events. They either said that it had been selected in error or on accident, or kind of jumping ahead to this bottom note here on the slide, the location of other bias. So we had many agencies tell us that none is next to the drop-down option for other, and it had just been selected accidentally. So right off the top of those 214 offenses, more than 100 were taken out just because they were improperly coded. So of the incidents that we were able to read and code through, what we found are a couple of different things. So the incidents that did appropriately fit in our other bias category were typically focused on damage to political signs and political flags. However, there often is not enough information in the narratives to fully support and know that it was a bias motivated crime. In other incidents, we found that there was a bias motivation. However, it better fit one of the bias categories that already existed. And we also found an issue with personal grudges and vendettas being listed as an other bias. So, for example, one of those offenses that sticks in my mind was that a person had cut the brakes on their friend's car because the friend had slept with their girlfriend. They probably might feel some hate towards that person for doing that, but that does not meet our definition of a hate crime. Additionally, there were other situations like that, or other incidents that didn't really have evidence in the narrative that supported it being marked as a bias motivated crime. Next slide, please. So this research was kind of a first step into taking a deep dive into what our hate bias research and hate bias offenses are showing us. So this is going to lead us to essentially digging in deeper. So we're going to increase our examination into offenses marked as bias motivated, as well as offenses that aren't marked as bias motivated, but should be. However, that's a very big project to try to figure out what's missing. Additionally, we are going to look at extended training, specifically focused on reporting bias motivated crimes. And in trainings this past year, when we kind of brought up this idea, many local agencies were interested, and this is something that is being requested, that we could give more training on how to report bias motivated crimes. And we will also be conducting more research to look into if there's other bias options or bias categories that need to be included. So we are including as many options as available and get the most accurate data possible. Next slide, please. All right. As Tiara said, we will all be around for any questions you may have. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Anne. Your presentation was very interesting. It was interesting to hear about how data is collected right here in Michigan, and I'd love to hear more about it, perhaps during the question and answer portion at the end. So far during this forum, we have taken a look at the federal data and how discrepancies arise between the data and the lived experiences of everyday people. We have also taken a look at Michigan's data collection process. Right now, we have the pleasure of learning about what's happening at the state level in another part of the country. Our next presenter traveled a great distance to be here today, all the way from California by logging on to Zoom, and we are so excited to have her here to talk about alternatives to traditional reporting measures and the impact of accurate reporting. It is my honor to introduce to you Becky L. Monroe, who is the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives and External Affairs for California's Civil Rights Department. Monroe has worked as a civil rights attorney for over 20 years with a focus on hate crimes. Before moving to California, Monroe led the Fighting Hate and Bias program for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a national coalition of more than 200 civil rights organizations in Washington, D.C., and started the Stop the Hate Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She also served as director of the Divided Communities Project at Ohio State's Moritz College of Law. In 2009, Monroe was appointed by President Obama to work for the U.S. DOJ through the end of his administration in 2017. She led the U.S. DOJ's Community Relations Service and then served as Director of Policy and Senior Counselor in the U.S. DOJ's Civil Rights Division. Monroe was on detail as a Senior Policy Advisor for the White House Domestic Policy Council on Civil Rights Issues from 2014 to 2015. Before joining the administration, Monroe was a legal services lawyer representing low-wage immigrant workers and people trafficked for labor. We are so honored to have Becky L. Monroe here with us today. Becky, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Tiara. And I want to thank, on behalf of the California Civil Rights Department, thank all of our colleagues, the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. We are really honored to be working with our state partners in this way to combat hate for people in both of our states. So I am today going to talk a little bit about why this data matters so much. Why does it matter to communities? How can it keep us safer if we have more accurate reporting? Next slide, please. I can move to the next slide again. Thank you. So I want to give you a very quick background on our mission, and you will see it reflects our colleagues again in Michigan and the Department of Civil Rights mission there. Here we are the California Civil Rights Agency, and our mission is to protect people from unlawful discrimination in employment, housing, other forms of discrimination, as well as from hate violence and human trafficking. I wanted to share this mission because we think it is important to note that when people are targeted for hate, they may also be targeted for discrimination. So it's important as we respond that we recognize that if you are targeted for discrimination in some way, it may be challenging to identify exactly what part of the criminal code or civil code is being violated. So part of the message today is there is no wrong door. And I think you heard that earlier from Alexandra Wyatt in terms of how Michigan approaches hate, violence, and discrimination. If people want to report an act of hate or an act of discrimination, it's important that we find a way to respond. Next slide, please. So in our Civil Rights Department, we do enforce a whole host of laws, including what we call the Ralph Act, which is an act that provides civil claims for hate violence. I'm emphasizing this here because one of the things you heard from the FBI is, some people feel like they've been targeted for a hate crime, but it's not actually a crime. Maybe it's a hate incident. One of the things I want to talk about is what is the difference between an incident and a crime, and why it's important that we think about how we respond to both. Both provide opportunities to serve the people in our states. Both provide opportunities for law enforcement and for government to earn the trust of the people we serve. Next slide. So today I'm going to go through these 4 different elements. First, I'm going to talk about why community engagement is central to improving reporting. So next slide, please. Why is community engagement important? And we heard this a little bit from Alexandra earlier. People feel reporting, they're scared of reporting, they think it won't make a difference. We talked about, and I think you heard this from the FBI as well, law enforcement may need additional training. They may not recognize a hate crime when they see it, may not be able to offer resources to people targeted for hate. And finally, studies demonstrate that when you have greater communication between community and law enforcement, you can actually improve the accurate reporting of hate crimes. So there's actually data that shows that when law enforcement is engaged with the community, when they have the opportunity for people to ask questions, to learn more about their rights, they are more likely to report. The thing I want to leave this slide with is when you live in a community and you know that people are being targeted for hate, targeted for discrimination, and you know and you learn that the department that represents you, that serves you, is reporting that no hate crimes have occurred, it can really undermine hard-earned trust in communities. I know that in the state of Michigan, just like in the state of California, there are law enforcement agencies that are really working to earn that trust. Unfortunately, you can really undermine that trust if you send a message that no acts of hate occurred when somebody knows their daily lived experience is such that those actions are actually occurring. That's why it matters. When we were talking earlier, the FBI mentioned sometimes it's hard to convince a prosecutor to bring a hate crimes enhancement. Sometimes it's hard to encourage a law enforcement officer to report something as a hate crime. It matters because if we don't enforce the laws that are on the books, people are going to start to not trust that their agency is actually there to protect them. And so this is, I've had the opportunity to work with law enforcement across the country around hate incidents and hate crimes. And you will hear every time I talk to an officer, every time I talk to a leader who has responded to an act of hate, they will talk about how it was part of why they became a law enforcement officer was to enforce these rights, and they recognized that that built trust in a way that allowed them to do their job more effectively. Next slide, please. One thing I want to note, and I talked a little bit to Tiara about this before, is when we talk about increasing reports in hate, sometimes you will hear maybe from a local government official or a police chief, I'm not sure if I want to be the chief or the mayor that's presiding over the city when we see the greatest increase in acts of hate. Because one of the things that can happen is that when we encourage people to report acts of hate, it certainly can mean that there is an increase in hate crimes, but it also means that people feel greater trust to report. So what can happen is you see an increase in hate crimes and people can say, wow, this doesn't look good for my community. When in fact, it actually means that you have built enough trust for people to report. We all know we are living at a time when acts of hate are happening. So when 0 is reported, that is not a sign of safety. In fact, it's a sign that people don't feel safe reporting. And I just provided this one example because I did some training in Phoenix with the police department. And one of the things we heard, it came shortly after some of the data came out from the FBI, for 2017. And it said that Phoenix had the third most reported hate crimes in the country, more than many other cities with larger populations. And I had the chance to talk to the detective who's in charge of hate crimes there. And she shared this interview that she did with a local news station where they said, do we have a hate problem? And she said, no, it's because our system of reporting is broken. We are doing more to report hate, and so therefore our numbers look higher. So one of the things in the next slide I want to talk about is, as community leaders, as community advocates, and move to the next slide when you get a chance, you can help to address this issue. One of the things we talk about is community advocates will often say, how can we help to address this reporting issue? There are many ways. One is community-based organizations have often earned the trust of communities, so people may come to them to report acts of hate. So for example, if you are targeted, you may go to your mosque, you may go to your synagogue, you may go to the LGBTQ center, and you may feel safer talking to them. Those agencies, those entities can help serve as a bridge to report. We also talked about the fact that civil rights groups, those kinds of religious institutions, agencies can also speak up and say, we know that if the numbers go up in our city, that means that you are working to earn our trust. Send out the message that an increase in reporting numbers is not necessarily a bad thing. It can mean that we are working more effectively to earn the trust of people to report. And I will thank you. This is great. Well, next slide, please. So next, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what's an effective way to help people report in a way that's maybe not as traditional. And so I'm going to share very briefly a new resource we have in California, but I'm going to emphasize the elements that I think would be applicable in Michigan or really anywhere across the country. We have created in California the California versus Hate resource line and network. People can call or go online. And when they call or go online, they don't have to know if they are a victim of a crime or not. They just have to know that they have been targeted for discrimination and want to know their options. They want to connect with culturally competent resources and support. We also are going to use this line to improve our hate incident and hate crime reporting data. And we make sure that we have ongoing training on cultural competence and expand the network of resources that we can connect people with. One thing that's important here is that you do not have to go to law enforcement if you call our agency. We reinforce civil rights laws. We are not connected to the police. This is important because some people may not feel safe initially going to the police. They may feel safer coming to report to get resources, and it may be that at a later point they feel more comfortable doing that, but we want to give people the option. Next slide, please. So again, this is just to give you, in terms of accessibility, we are able to provide services in over 200 languages when people call, 15 languages online. And we are utilizing the 211 statewide network, which I think every state has some 211 resource. And that is also emphasizing we're talking about connecting with social services. If people want to go to law enforcement, we can help give them some context for what that will look like, how to do that. We can help them connect, but we don't want to put pressure if people aren't ready. Next slide, please. So this just gives you some more logistics on how we're handling the intake process. And I'll go to the next slide, please. And it's just that it's available by phone and online. And again, we're just going to let people know their options. Let them know that civil or criminal legal action may be a possibility, and connect with social services. Our goal is whenever possible to connect with culturally competent community-based organizations. So recognizing that we as the state can do the best that we can, but that at the end of the day, people are going to trust the organizations that have been in their community for a long time. So we have an obligation as the state to support those community-based organizations. Next slide, please. These are some elements of a comprehensive approach to combating hate that I think we're already hearing is in place in Michigan, and that are sort of practices we've learned through our own experience. One is that meaningful community engagement and partnerships matter. What I'm saying here is I mentioned that we know community-based groups have the trust. We also know that they're overwhelmed and overburdened. So we are making sure that we compensate them for their time when they weigh in to provide us feedback about the hotline and help us to expand our outreach. We again want to respect our existing resources and incorporate those efforts that are ongoing. I know in Michigan, there are communities that have been combating hate for a long time, and it's critical that we recognize those efforts. Direct engagement with community-based organizations across the state. So making sure, again, that we are connecting directly with the organizations that have been doing this work, and that we provide confidentiality and choice for people who are reporting. Again, if you want to report to law enforcement, we can help you do that. If you don't, it is important that people have the agency to make that decision so that they still feel safe reaching out to get support. Next slide, please. And I'll just finish with these elements by sort of summarizing that we have mechanisms for ongoing review. We know we have to hold ourselves accountable. We are very aware that we are reaching not only individuals who are targeted for hate, we are letting organizations who serve people who may be targeted, we are serving them as well. We are telling them, if people are coming to you, you as an organization can come to us and we will meet those needs as you identify them because you are a trusted bridge between the community. We provide case coordination services. This is not a simply someone calls and we say, here's 5 resources and good luck. We have someone who provides, if the person is interested, care coordination services, meaning we will stay with them. We will get on the phone with them if they want to reach out to one of the resources we've identified. We will follow up, make sure that they're getting what they need. We also think data disaggregation is critical. And again, this is more for the data nerds out there, but it's actually also really for the communities. In particular, in Asian American communities, we know there's a tendency not to disaggregate. So to put all Asian American communities together, that is not the way we should be doing our work as a state, because we recognize that different communities have different needs. So we are committed to sort of disaggregating, which means breaking apart to make sure we're recognizing different communities. And finally, we capture incidents and crimes. And I will tell you, again, definition of a crime you have seen, it's when there's a violation of the law and there's a crime and it was motivated by bias. A hate incident, there are kind of 2 kinds of incidents. One could be a violation of civil rights law, just not a criminal law. So it could be another form of discrimination, which I know our colleagues at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights are very interested in. We are certainly interested in that in California. And then another, as you heard from the FBI, could be something that's not against the law, but is still causing a lot of harm. It is important that we capture this information because it is helpful for us to identify where there may be issues in the future and where there may be hate incidents or hate crimes in the future. I will just note, if you look at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, their model policy for hate crimes, they are the largest law enforcement agency, largest agency for law enforcement leaders. If you look at their model policy, they say they encourage agencies to collect incidents and crimes. So this is a growing consensus across both law enforcement and community groups that capturing both is important. Next slide, please. And then this final piece, which I think we're kind of doing today, and this is why we were so proud to partner with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, is we have to earn trust, and that means investing in earning trust through providing these kinds of trainings, making sure law enforcement has materials so that, for example, if they respond to something, it's not a crime. Rather than having to say, I'm sorry, we can't do anything, they can say, we as a department can't do anything, but here are some resources. That helps build trust. Commit to regular public reporting of data. We are also finding other ways to capture data, recognizing that the hate crimes reporting system, for the reasons you heard from Alexandra, from Anne, may need additional, it needs some additional work. So there are other ways to capture this information through surveys. Make sure you have language access. Make sure you're coordinating across government agencies. People who are targeted for hate, may not care which part of the state is responding, which part of their local government is responding. They just need a response. So we owe it to them to make sure we're coordinating effectively and make sure we do not leave out legal, healthcare, mental health, other resources that people may need when they're targeted for hate. Next slide, please. This is just to share some more about how we're trying to approach this from a comprehensive way. In California, we also have a state-appointed commission on the state of hate that is dedicated to capturing data on hate crimes and to sort of holding ourselves accountable as we try to respond to acts of hate. The next slide, please. And finally, we also have a community conflict resolution team, which is a team that is dedicated to respecting the fact that communities often have the answers to address hate and bias in their communities, but they haven't had the opportunity to be at the table to do so. So when there is an act of hate, when there is an act of excessive use of force, we can be in the community, we can help to make sure that the people who are most impacted are at the table, that they have the opportunity to really shape what the next steps are in a community in terms of responding to an act of hate, developing programs that help to address these issues going forward, and make sure that communities are at the center of defining what public safety looks like and of making determinations about what they want to see in terms of services going forward. Next slide, please. Thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Wow, Becky, that was such a powerful presentation. It really gives us some things to consider in terms of evaluating our approach to hate crime reporting. And I'm excited to continue to explore what new possibilities there may be here in Michigan. At this time, we're going to switch to our question and answer portion of the program. A lot of great information was shared today, and I want to give everyone the opportunity to grapple with and really digest what they have heard. So I'm going to now ask all of our panelists to turn on your cameras, and we will begin taking questions. As a quick reminder, please remember to state your name before proceeding to speak. And we will now open the floor for questions. All right. So I have a question for SSA Guillahan. In your opinion, is mandating official reporting something that might address the gaps that currently exist between local, state, and law enforcement organizations?
This is Pat speaking, and thank you for that question, Tiara. You know, that is a question that has come up a lot when we discuss hate crime reporting, right? You know, I'll be honest, this is a question that I am 50-50 on. On the one hand, I like using the power of the federal government to do good. I think better hate crime statistics are good, but I also worry about the possibility of what we call sort of malicious compliance, right? If we make you answer a question, are you going to do the bare minimum, or are you going to do, you know, the work that it actually needs to? And I don't know the right answer there. You know, I would fear that we would get a lot of agencies that would simply fill out everything with code 88, no bias, without considering the greater ramifications of that. Having said all of that, I think I would rather take the swing at it. I would rather mandate it and hope that places come into play. I think personally that if you take a group of people and you tell them that they have to do something, most of them are going to do it right. And I would rather us try to go for it. And, you know, maybe we're wrong, but I think it'd be a good experiment, if nothing else.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for that answer. And I'm just wondering if any of our other panelists may want to weigh in on that. Becky?
Yeah, this is Becky, and I agree. I think it is, you know, and this is just from my own personal perspective. I've worked a lot with victim and victim families, including the families of victims who were targeted for hate crimes, who maybe were killed in a hate crime. There were cases that found that, in fact, the perpetrator was guilty of a hate crime and they weren't reported as hate crimes. And the fact that they weren't reported by the local agency as a hate crime was pretty devastating to these families. And in fact, we've seen recent federal legislation meant to address that. The Jabara Hire Act, which is part of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, was named after two people who were killed in hate crimes. The hate crimes were, the cases where the defendants were found to be guilty of hate crimes, and yet they weren't counted in the local data. So I think I have to agree. I think it's worth trying. I think it's incredibly important, not only to the victim families, but to communities. If somebody shares the identity of someone who's been targeted for hate, they know it was a hate crime, and the case is even brought and it's found to be a hate crime and it's still not reported, it really does undermine a lot of trust.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for that, Becky. And I do have a follow-up question. So in the absence of mandated reporting, what recommendations would you have for law enforcement organizations who are looking to get it right? Any of our panelists can answer that.
So this is Pat speaking. I think personally that the biggest issue that we have is education, right? It is make sure that we get in front of these law enforcement officials and we train them on what to look for and what to find. And I think it's important to kind of go back to a point Becky had earlier, to make sure that these places understand that more reporting doesn't necessarily make them look worse. It is a net long-term benefit for any agency or any group. And I think that's the hardest thing to sort of get across there. I have talked to law enforcement officials who have told me that, the more of this that we report, the worse we look. And that's especially true, I think, in rural areas where they're struggling with their handling of these issues. And, I have a dialogue open with a sheriff in my area who comes from an area where bias, especially bias against African Americans, was something that was very prevalent 40 years back. And he has done a lot of work to clean that up and to make that better. And then when you go talk to him and you say, hey, I need you to start reporting more of these incidents, to him, that sounds like a backslide, right? It sounds like now we're going to look worse than we did. Why did we do this work? Do we want to portray this area as that sort of place again? And I think trying to get that across to these folks, trying to get across the idea that, accurate, timely reporting is better for everyone is really where this has to go from the law enforcement perspective.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Patrick, for that. That's a very valid point, and I was so glad that Becky actually addressed that in her presentation. Becky, I don't know if you would like to say more about that.
Yeah, this is Becky speaking, and thank you. And I definitely agree that sort of addressing the importance of reporting. And one of the things that I've talked to police leaders about is I understand the fear of having your city or your county or not look the way that you want it to. But the reality is the communities who are targeted know if they've been targeted. So you can, it's really important. We all went into this work, whether it's city officials or law enforcement or state officials, or, we went into this because we want to serve our communities. So we have to center them. So if they're the ones who are suffering, we have to acknowledge that that is happening, because if we don't, we cannot be effective in serving them because we've lost that trust. And I think, there are ways that community-based organizations can help to support that. Can help to tell the law enforcement leader, we will be behind you when you report, when you have the first report for hate crimes, we will be behind you and say, this matters to us. And this is actually a sign that things are going the way they should. And then I just wanted to respond to another part of your question about other things law enforcement can do. I do think if someone calls to report an act of hate and it's not actually a hate crime, so you can't do anything as law enforcement, definitely acknowledge, I am a law enforcement officer, this is what I can handle, but I understand that this caused a lot of pain. I think you heard that, I think Patrick talked about this earlier. I understand this caused harm, here are other resources. If you can connect with other resources, you can help to build that trust.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Becky. Providing other resources is critical. We do have a question from one of our
Tiara.
participants. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, can I interject real quick?
Sure.
I just wanted to say something. I think it's also important, this is Alex speaking, that if we do get the accurate reporting, that will also reflect accurate resources. And that helps get resources to the people that need them the most. So with mandated reporting or with going out and realizing maybe our numbers are higher, of not thinking about how it will affect the police department or law enforcement, but how it will affect the victims. And like Becky said, they will feel validated and heard that they are being noticed and also get the resources that they deserve. So we always find ourselves in this crypt of, you know, we see this at a local level of in our community efforts and advocacy of things are going on, but we don't have the money or the resources to handle what's going on. And so if we're able to show that with the data and reporting, that can help us tremendously. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for that, Alex. And so I heard you say that accurate data helps us funnel the resources to where they need to go. And that is a very great point. I do want to go to our Q&A. We did have someone put a question in there that says, do you encounter resistance from local law enforcement due to existing tensions with the impacted community? And how do you address this? I'll read it again. Do you encounter resistance from local law enforcement due to existing tensions with the impacted community? And how do you address this? Any of our panelists can answer that question.
You know, I will, this is Pat speaking. I'll take a quick swing at this. I definitely see some of this as I talk to my local counterparts. What's interesting is that a lot of it seems to be, you know, personal, right? It's, you know, a law enforcement officer serves in a community for many years, ends up in, you know, a poor relationship with a member of the other community. It seems to be less group based. And, you know, one of the things that I've talked about with some of these leaders is, you know, maybe the answer is for you personally to step out of this, you know, delegate that to a deputy chief, a section chief, you know, fill in the blank here. There's all kinds of ranks in law enforcement. But to try to get that issue out of a personal animus, right? It's not you against that guy that you don't like from before. It is one organization with another organization and try to meet a middle ground. You know, one of the things that law enforcement I think has gotten better at over the time that I've been in is, you know, meeting these groups, any kind of community group off the books, right? Not when something bad happens, not after an issue, but before, right? Regular meetings where things can be talked about. You know, Tiara and I both regularly attend a community group meeting where, you know, there has been a lot of tension over the last, you know, 40, 50 years. And I won't say that there's not tension in that meeting still, but everybody's bringing their own perspective to the table, and at least hearing each other out. And I think in a lot of cases, that's what's necessary, right? It's not that we have to agree. It's not that we have to get exactly on the same page. It's that I can see the situation from your perspective, and I can help apply your perspective to my understanding of it. And that connection, right? That community connection to law enforcement, to getting everybody in the same room and making sure that everybody's listening to each other, I think is the easiest and best way to address this.
Thank you, Patrick.
This is Alex speaking. I just want to say, I think I've also found that we have come a very far way. And because of the era that we're in, we see a lot of law enforcement reaching out and wanting assistance, wanting to become culturally competent, to go out into communities and to be part of the community outreach so that they understand what's going on. But we still have a very long way to go. But I think that has surprisingly been part of discussions in community groups and understanding and trying to build on that to move forward.
Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. We have another question from the chat. This one is addressed to Becky. It says the system being implemented in California is great. Have you shared this with other states?
Thank you. And I should say we are new. So we just had our soft launch for California versus hate in November, and the hard launch, which means we'll have the statewide marketing and outreach plan, will be this spring. So we have tried to work and learn from a lot of other states that have been trying to do this work. We've talked to our colleagues in Oregon who've been trying to do this kind of work, we've also learned a lot. I mean, Tiara was, I think, was one of my, the most frequent people I called over the last couple of months when I learned more about what Michigan is doing in terms of reaching young people and youth. So in terms of civil rights issues more broadly. So we are working on it, and I appreciate it. We're really committed to holding ourselves accountable. So we are going to make sure that the CBOs that we are working with are compensated to make sure that we're paying for their time, but also that they feel like they can tell us what's working and what's not. So I think we have a long way to go, but we're also working with our federal partners and others to share what we've learned so that the others can try and do some of the similar work. And I just wanted to sort of support what Pat and Alexandra were saying. I think the question was so well put about, communities that have tension with law enforcement. The reality is, when you look at who's targeted for hate, there is a very strong overlap with who doesn't have trust in law enforcement. And so I think that's a reality that we work a lot with law enforcement to discuss. And I think, as Alexandra said, more and more law enforcement is trying to find a way to build that trust, trying to find a way to sort of recognize how to address those issues. And I think Pat laid out some really practical ways for law enforcement to address individual needs. But I think it's also, like he said, when you, the time to make a friend is not when you need a friend. You need to get out and talk to communities ahead of time, talk about what resources you offer, make sure people feel comfortable, and be prepared for people to be angry and to be scared and to share information with you that is not always pleasant to hear at first. But when you keep coming back, then people start realizing that you really will be there to serve them.
Thank you. This is Tiara speaking. We have another question from our audience. The question is special attention needed for under color of law hate crimes? Any of our panelists can take a stab at that one.
So I want to just kind of draw just a very quick distinction here, and I don't know if the question asker was framing it this way, but I just want to draw a distinction. Color of law crimes, federally speaking, are crimes committed by someone who is operating in an official capacity. Some of them are also hate crimes. Okay, they're also bias motivated, but the category of color of law is much broader. That would be anything that is done that is illegal by someone who is operating in an official capacity. And I say that because we don't automatically categorize color of law crimes as hate crimes. They're two separate questions. Is it under color of law? Is it bias motivated? But just to talk very, very briefly about color of law, hate crimes, we have had a long-term sort of project in the FBI to kind of look at that, right? Where does bias exist in policing, right? We know bias exists in everyday life. We know bias exists really in almost every person, every color, every system, every whatever. But to really look at bias in policing, and that's a conversation that's been had a lot, especially over the last decade or 2 decades. And it's an answer that I don't think we have good data on. And the reason for that, I think, is that we sort of go back to one of the issues that I brought up, which is how deep are we going to dig on some of these, right? If we have an incident where a law enforcement officer acts, under color of law against someone, if we're prosecuting them for the assault or prosecuting them for the civil rights violation. And in that specific case, we're classifying the civil right as a violation of one of your constitutional rights. How deep are we going to dig to find out if there's also a bias motivation? How deep are we going to dig to find out if there's, some other issue? A lot of folks think that there's not a lot of benefit there, right? We've solved the problem. We've charged the crime, and we've fixed the civil rights issue. Do we dig deeper? And I think there's benefit into looking into that more specifically. But this is again where we have a bit of a training issue, right? Now we're talking about specifically speaking to internal affairs detectives, Office of Professional Responsibility folks, and saying to them, we need you to look deeper into this. Do you see signs of bias? Do you see signs of some kind of motivation for this that isn't just, whatever the instigating, problem was? And I think there also we need to look at making sure that people understand as part of that training that it doesn't have to be the whole thing. It doesn't have to be the primary driver. It doesn't, it just has to have existed and had to have contributed. And I think that sort of thing is going to give us better data on that to really tell where the color of law, hate crime Venn diagram comes together.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Patrick, for that response. I think from our perspective, it's necessary to dig deeper. We have to dig deeper to determine when biases are in operation in our organizations, in our workplaces. So that's something that I think definitely a lot of attention needs to go toward. Let's see. Trying to keep up with these questions here. I did have a question that I wanted to direct to Anne from the audience. It says, when offenses are reported, but they are improperly coded, is there any communication with the victim or local programs with an explanation?
This is Anne speaking. So when the data comes to the state level, we actually are not collecting any personally identifying information. So we are not able to identify that victim. The way that we would be able to find any of these kinds of issues would be when we were doing a quality assurance review, reviewing those narratives, and we're able to actually see the officer's description of what occurred. But there is some kind of internal processes at the local law enforcement agency level that, right, somebody is reviewing these reports, and right, they could be kind of determining or doing that kind of digging. But once it gets to the state level, we do not have any personally identifying information, so we are not able to make any contact with the victim.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for that, Anne. I will ask another question of you. Are there any process improvements in the works or challenges you all are currently working to overcome in terms of data collection here in Michigan? And if so, what supports are needed to accomplish this?
We are, this is our little unit, engaging in a whole lot of projects to just further enhance the accuracy and quality of the data that we are collecting. So as I kind of outlined in my brief presentation, we are digging deeper into bias motivated offenses. And from that, we are going to develop training for agencies to better inform them on what hate bias incidents are, how to report them, and additionally, right, like other resources that are available that if they've run into an incident, that, for example, the AG's office has resources that they can dig into or tap into to be able to help them better, right, investigate and support victims.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you, Anne. I love to hear that training is being developed. I think it's very necessary and it'll be very beneficial. I do have a question for the entire panel. Is community collaboration regarding tracking hate crimes and bias data something that is currently welcomed by your respective organizations? And if so, how might a nonprofit or community organization looking to collaborate with your organization become successful in this work?
This is Becky speaking, so I will say wholeheartedly, yes, this is something we definitely welcome. And again, there's data to demonstrate that when there is kind of community engagement from our agency, from law enforcement agencies, that you do see more accurate reporting, which again, to Alexandra's point, means more resources get to victims, survivors, and actually to law enforcement. I mean, that's one of the things too, is data is often your voice to the legislature and to others. So I would say for community-based organizations that are interested in getting involved, there are so many ways. So one is, I mentioned before, if you reach out to your city, your local government official, reach out to the police chief and say, we think reporting matters. We know that we want to see better reporting. We will be with you when you report an increase in hate crimes. We will talk about why we think that's actually positive that people are reporting more. So that's one thing. I think another that we are particularly trying to cultivate in California is I think like Michigan, have so many tremendous community-based organizations providing in language, culturally competent resources and support. So if you are one of those service agencies, do reach out to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, reach out to others and say, we have the resources to support, whether it's culturally competent mental health care, maybe it's social services that are connected to after-school programs, whatever you offer that may be of interest to communities that are targeted for hate, that may be fearful, offer those services. And then finally, something I have done many times, both when I was in the federal government and now in the state government, and when I was at an NGO, was you can help to provide training. So one of the things you can do for law enforcement, for example, we would partner with a Sikh organization that would provide information on Sikhism and their faith. You can partner with an LGBT organization that can come to law enforcement and talk about these are the practices that work when you engage with us. So there's so many ways for NGOs who are committed to this work to reach out. I just want to say it is the obligation, though, as a government official, it resides with us. So to the extent government can reach out to make those affirmative outreach, it's important. And we have to do it outside the situation, a crisis situation, to Patrick's point earlier. We got to do it now. We got to do it when people aren't in a crisis, where you can earn that trust and just recognize we've got a lot of work to do to earn it, and that's okay. But it's going to take some time. So thank you.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much, Becky. Alex, would you like to answer that question as well?
Yes, Tiara, thank you. I just want to echo everything that Becky said. I think you said it very well, and I think it is up to us to make those contacts, but we are open to working together to fight hate. I think it takes a community, it takes everyone to put together the education and working together to have that multidisciplinary approach to really eradicate the violence that we have in our communities. And we are wholeheartedly open to coming into different community organizations and having people come to us to explain services, because I will be the first to know that I don't know, or first to say that I don't know everything, and I'm happy to learn, and I want to learn, and I want to be able to support your community. So please, please reach out, and we're happy to help.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much, Alex. As promised at the beginning of this program, we do have a very special presentation for you. But before we get to that, I want to ask one final question, and I'll ask that of Alex. If you could send a message right now to a victim who is fearful of coming forward to make a report, what would that be?
You have every right to be afraid, and I am so sorry that that has happened to you. But I want you to know that support is available, and your voice deserves to be heard. You deserve to have justice, and there are people out there that do care and want to help you. So please, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you want to just talk about your options and know that what it would look like, what the processes looks like when you make a report, I'm happy to walk through that with you, but know that you're not alone and you don't have to feel alone anymore.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for that, Alex. On that note, there are many resources for those who have experienced hate crimes or bias incidents. The Michigan Department of Civil Rights is one of those resources. As promised at the beginning of this forum, we have a special presentation that we would like for you all to view. What you are about to see was a labor of love produced by MDCR's Community Engagement Division in collaboration with Amplified Media and Communication and a host of individuals and small business owners from all across the state of Michigan. We are pleased to present to you a first look at the public service announcement developed as part of our My Response to Hate campaign. Please watch.
Did you know that race is the #1 motivating factor for hate crimes in the United States?
Did you know that hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased by over 73% since 2019?
Did you know that there are state and federal laws that protect you against hate crimes and bias incidents?
The Michigan Department of Civil Rights and the Michigan Alliance Against Hate Crimes have launched the My Response to Hate campaign to inform Michiganders of hate crimes and bias incidents occurring in Michigan.
You can take action in your own way by showing love, not hate.
If you see something, say something.
Support victims. Report the incident.
Make a commitment.
My response to hate.
My response to hate.
My response to hate. My response to hate is love.
Visit michigan.gov/MDCR for more information on hate crimes, bias incidents, and available resources.
So we hope that you enjoyed the PSA and that you found it informative. Please be on the lookout and be prepared to share it once it has officially been published on our social media platforms. Again, I would like to extend major thanks to all of our panelists. Your expertise and insights have been invaluable. I would also like to thank all of our registered participants and those who have viewed via live stream. We would like to welcome all of you back for our next campaign forum, which is scheduled for Thursday, February 23rd, 2023 from 6 to 8 p.m. This next forum will focus on implementing DEI strategies in employment. Also, don't forget to stay tuned for ways that you can get involved because eliminating hate and bias in our state is all of our responsibility. You can learn more by visiting the Michigan Department of Civil Rights website at www.michigan.gov/MDCR. Wishing you all a safe and restful evening. This is Tiara Yakini signing off. Thank you.